In the remainder of my talk, I will focus principally on the existential issue of climate change and the profound challenges it poses to our civilization, and then I will conclude with some very brief remarks on China. We must first understand about climate change that it is an issue of such profound importance that our success or our failure in managing it will determine the future of our civilization within the lifetimes of our children and our grandchildren. The fundamental understanding of the complex issues involved and the conclusions and messages of science are overwhelmingly clear, in spite of all the surface noise. We run the risk of triggering dangerous climate change if we do not take strong action to cut emissions very soon. And worldwide evidence is now demonstrating the real consequences of what in fact is a relatively small increase in temperature so far of around 0.8 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. The pace of change is very fast. This picture simply shows you not only that the area of ice in the Arctic has diminished, but also the thickness. And the amount of ice which is over 3 years old is getting smaller and smaller all the time. In fact, in 1994, there was an estimated 25,000 cubic kilometers of floating ice in the Arctic. This has now fallen by 80%. Now, climate change is perhaps the most complex issue that we have ever attempted to negotiate internationally, and the world community of nations is struggling to formulate and to agree on action to face these growing threats. And this will entail deep changes in the social and economic structures of our societies. And history shows that such change always, and quite naturally, provokes intense opposition from those whose interests are vested deeply in the present system. This is what is now happening as the issue of climate change moves from the worlds of science and environment into the brutal world of politics and commercial interests. Our leaders will have to find the courage to overcome these powerful lobbies to act in the wider interests of humanity. Now, let me very quickly sketch some of the realities of climate change. First, the scale and urgency of the challenge. In spite of all our efforts, as I showed you, negotiations, agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol and all the consultations and discussions, concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere continue to increase and are still above the worst-case scenario of IPCC. Even if all the commitments which were proposed at Copenhagen had been agreed and implemented, we would still be on a path to around 3.5 to 4 degrees rise in temperature. If we continue on our present path, global average temperatures could rise by over 6 degrees, as I said, by 2100. But this would mean by double this amount in some regions of the world, such as Greenland or the Swiss Alps. Such a rise would provoke intolerable conditions, not for the planet, which couldn't care less, the planet has been here before, but for humanity. And any such outcome would, of course, be disastrous. To give you an idea of the linkages which I've mentioned, a simple one is the following. Any such rise in temperature will be particularly damaging to the vital biodiversity and terrestrial and ocean ecosystems on which we depend. IPCC has concluded that a rise of 0.1 degrees in a decade puts 15% of the affected species at risk, and we've heard already this morning from the minister that in Hong Kong the rise of temperature is above this figure. Also, the terrestrial and ocean ecosystems of the planet absorb around 50% of our emissions. Clearly, if we degrade them, that is stupid, because they will then absorb less, and the net emissions into the atmosphere will increase. The scale of the challenges ahead is shown by the following simple point. To meet the energy needs of a world population of 9 billion people will require, it is estimated, around doubling of world energy output by 2050. That is to meet the needs of billions of poor people and a very much larger global middle class. But we know that we must at the same time cut emissions by between 50 and 80%, as I have said, if we are to maintain the stability of the climate. How are we going to do that? Another perspective to concentrate our minds is that it has taken humanity around 250 years to burn the first 500 billion tons of carbon, with the consequences which we see today. If we carry on the current path, we would burn the next 500 billion tons in 40 years. So the scale of the transition is considerable. These then, ladies and gentlemen, are the realities we face. Growth has indeed improved the lives of hundreds of millions of people, but at devastating cost to the environment. So let me say a few quick words about the underlying challenge of climate change. First of all, climate change is not an isolated, standalone issue. It is deeply integrated with other environmental factors and with economic and development issues as well. Secondly, if we are to reduce the risks of climate change, we must understand and act on its underlying causes. And these lie in the roots of our societies, in the values, behavior, and choices which drive the creation of demand and consumption and of waste and pollution. In fact, climate change is not an environmental problem. The symptoms of climate change are environmental. The causes are quite different and cannot, for example, be resolved by ministers of the environment. To resolve the threats of climate change and the other threats we face, we have to recognize the failure of our present models of economic growth, and we have to develop new concepts, new strategies, and new measures of progress, because GDP, and particularly GDP per capita, are very misleading measures of real progress in welfare. Thirdly, and perhaps most important of all, scientists have now understood more deeply the systems dynamics of the processes which drive climate change. And there is growing concern in the scientific community that we are approaching a tipping point where we will trigger a number of processes, what are called positive feedback loops, such as the loss of reflecting ice in the Arctic, which will lead to catastrophic climate change. And recent evidence regrettably shows that these feedback processes are already beginning to operate. Methane is now being released from methane hydrates in the Arctic Ocean and from melting tundra across northern Russia and Canada. The problem is that once we pass such a tipping point, cutting emissions will make very little difference. And in this perspective, we must understand that climate change will not be a gradual process of gentle warming, allowing us years to negotiate, to ratify, and to act. We are living in a fool's paradise. Climate change is a non-linear process which will surprise us all with sudden and damaging impacts. And we must therefore learn to manage these risks. And this is why many scientists are calling for a level of 350 parts per million, not 450. Now, of course, we are told that the threats are uncertain and that we cannot find the resources required. But surely it is precisely because our fate is uncertain that we must act. If we wait until the threats are clear, it will simply be too late to take action. And if it was worth trillions of dollars to stabilize the financial system, what is it worth to assure the future of humanity? Let me now say a few words about the central role of China. First, China's policies and attitudes to environmental protection have changed substantially from the early days of industrialization, of reform and opening up in the late 70s and early 80s. And China's leaders fully understand that China itself will be one of the worst impacted countries if climate change continues as currently predicted. Thus, China in reality does not have a choice between either development or the mitigation of climate change, because development would be undermined if climate change is not properly controlled. Secondly, although emissions per capita remain low, although emissions per capita remain very low, in fact 1/4 of US emissions, China is now the largest aggregate emitter, as we know, due to the large size of the Chinese population. And as GDP in China doubles every 8 or 9 years, aggregate emissions continue to grow in spite of China's remarkable achievements in improving energy efficiency. So recognizing these risks to the development of China itself and to the wider world, the Chinese leadership is committed to a program to reorient the economy onto a more sustainable, more equitable, and more balanced path, which is known as the Shaokang program under the leadership of NDRC, from which Mr. Sun Zhen comes. The idea, which is long established in Chinese policy, is to move towards an all-around prosperous society. And this implies massive investments in education, science, and innovation, particularly into green technologies and new methods of production. And in adopting this path, China intends to become a world leader in clean energy and resource-efficient technologies. In fact, they see these problems as an opportunity, not simply as a cost or a problem to be solved. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have outlined the critical systemic issues which face the world community of nations. And as we have so many eminent participants from universities, let me simply say that one of the challenges will be to shift patterns of teaching in institutions of higher education so that the next generation of young leaders will be able to understand and manage systemic problems. The days are gone when we can continue to pretend that these problems can be solved by managing the bits and not understanding the whole. We have enormous capabilities to move towards the new resource-efficient, low-carbon economies of the future, which will offer enormous opportunities for employment, for welfare, and for happiness. And we could and we can act now, and indeed, we have to act now. China will play a crucial role in determining whether we can overcome the challenges we face to achieve prosperity and peace for future generations. Thank you very much.